9 months. So it is really good to be getting back into it in a formal setting around the table. And I would like to declare the meeting open and invite everyone to stand to say the opening karakia. Whakatau, te hao, te uru, whakatau, te tonga, kia mā kina ki uta, kia mā taratara ki tai, e hi aki ana te atakura, e teo, e huku, Tihei Māori ora. Are there any apologies? Have we got Councillor Wolfe attending remotely for this? Does anyone know? Is not.
We've got the links in.
Okay. Can we please just... Yeah, we'll just note that Councillor Wolfe isn't present at the moment, but okay. We don't formally have any apologies, so we'll move on from that. I haven't received some from Councillor Wolfe. So we'll move on to conflict of interest declarations. Are there any conflict of interest declarations in relation to the matters on the agenda today? No conflict of interest declarations. I'll move on to the confirmation of minutes. I move that the Council approves the minutes of the Annual Plan Long-Term Plan Committee meeting held on the 30th of June 2020, which have been circulated, in fact posted online, and that they be taken as read and confirmed as an accurate record of that meeting. Do I have a seconder for that? The Mayor, thank you. I now put that motion which has been moved and seconded. You know what to do. Councillor Rush. Okay, we'll close that. That looks like that's been carried. There are no items not on the agenda and no requests for public participation. So we'll move into our general business. Now, we haven't had a chance to ask questions about either of these papers, so we have asked that officers come to the table if people would like to ask questions. I'm assuming there probably are likely to be questions. Is that the case? Now, we're going to do each paper separately. And of course, I just want to make the point that we also have a workshop after this. This is quite an important workshop. So although we don't want to race through things, our proceedings today, we want to keep time in mind. So we are aiming to try and finish this meeting at 3 o'clock to allow time for a bit of a break and yeah. Yes. Okay, well, we have... Yeah, we are scheduled to 5. Yeah. Okay, so thank you, Jeffrey, Marty and Baz. I will open it up for questions and I'll take a speaking list. So, yeah, sure. Yeah.
Kia ora, councillors. So, so this paper is on the significant forecasting assumptions. So they are one of the key inputs into the long-term plan. The paper overview gives you an overview of the process and the approach to developing the assumptions and a brief summary of them. The body of the assumptions themselves are in the first attachment, Appendix A, which works through what the assumptions and broadly in the format in which they would appear in the long-term plan. Alongside that, Appendix B has some additional economic advice we've commissioned around the effects of COVID-19 to support those assumptions. And I guess together they're there to give you a sense of what the key assumptions are that drive our plans and drive our budgets in the long-term plan. And also, particularly, the economic forecasts give you a greater sense of the general economic conditions that will be prevailing around the plan to give you a better sense of the risks and conditions that sit alongside your plan to aid decision-making around your financial settings. So the paper is a noting paper, so we'll definitely take questions today. The forecast assumptions will be audited alongside the consultation document, and they'll come back to you for more formal adoption alongside that consultation document, which is currently planned around, I think, the 4th of March is when we're planning to do that. So it's not a decision-making today, it's a noting today. And so happy to take questions. We also have Infometrics, who prepared the report, available at the back. If we have questions in particular around that report, then they're happy to answer questions to that as well.
Thank you, Jeffrey. I saw your hand up, Jenny, and I've also got one from Laurie and Iona.
Thank you. If we can start, I've just got some questions about the assumptions that are in the appendix. If we could start with the one on climate change. Do you just want to talk us through kind of what this assumption is and how it's going to feed through into our financials? Because I think it's a bit less obvious than like inflation and asset revals, how this assumption is going to be built into our budgets.
So the climate change assumption there, so what we've tried to do is align as much as possible with the Ministry for the Environment's guidance around long-term planning and climate change, and particularly sea level rise. And so you'll see sort of a couple of assumptions effectively there, which reflect the guidance around the different classes of infrastructure and how they should plan for sea level rise. The way in which it flows through into the budget is this informs our infrastructure planning, our asset management plan. So they've identified climate change and sea level rise is relevant to a lot of the planning there, and so that flows through into the plans and responses that are built into those asset plans, which then flow through into the budgets, the capital spending upgrades and renewals that are sitting within the AMPs, which feed through into the overall LTP budget.
I just had a couple of questions about the inflation and the asset revals, particularly in the water space, and this is probably you, Marty. Just looking at those numbers, given the experiences that we've just had, they look on the low side. And I know they're not our numbers, they're kind of from Bill and other places, but can you talk us through the kind of the estimates around inflation and revals?
Sure. So the estimates around inflation are from Bill, and as you'll note, they are significantly lower than what historically the last 2 revals have come through for infrastructure. However, the revaluations are not just a price indexation of the cost, so it's not just the cost of materials there. There are a whole lot of assumptions and many, many factors that are included in a revaluation. For example, recent pipe work had found that the pipes are at a lower depth than previously estimated, and so that assumption then goes across the network. That it causes extra cost. It has nothing to do with the price indexation of the materials or the labour that are installing those pipes, but that adds another layer or factor in there. So you will see a discrepancy between what the cost adjusters are versus the impact of revaluations. We have historically adjusted or put a proxy in for revaluations due to these inflationary price adjusters, but that's been lower than what the actual valuations have come through at. So we've tried to up that a little.
Thanks, Marty. And I also just had a question about why is the buildings reval so high, 16.5% in that first year. I was just curious.
That's because we're currently going through the revaluation for buildings, and so that's an early estimate from the valuers of what that increase is. So that's probably the more accurate figure on the table.
If I may, thank you. I just had another question about in the significant asset life cycles, when we talk about the effects of the risk, it says the financial effect of uncertainty is likely to be immaterial. Can you talk us through that? Because I guess my feeling is that, you know, we've had this experience with the pipes where the financial effect has been anything other than immaterial. And it would just be good to talk through why you've stated that you think this assumption wouldn't have a similar effect.
So that the key risk that the assets wear out earlier rather than later than estimated is really around the cost of the entire network. So it's not just it's I guess trying to balance out the useful life of those assets, and then on the whole, is that useful life reliable? and I suppose you've got a mix there of useful lives in the table. And we haven't changed that significantly over time because that's, I guess, the feedback that we've got is that those are still those useful lives, and therefore they haven't really changed. Yes, some useful lives are shorter. For example, asbestos cement pipes, they have been adjusted for what the current estimate is rather than what they were originally planned to have. So we see a lower risk in those changing from where they are at the moment, I guess is what it's saying.
Chair? Well, hopefully. So it's also on the asset life cycles, and it's just around the seawalls. And I was just looking at the asset life cycle there. It says kind of 80 to 100 years. And I was like, a lot of our seawalls are probably not going to last 100 years when you put the climate change lens into that. And so I was just trying to untangle, like I get that the height of the wall that's there will be good for 100 years, but it may not be high enough in future. So I just thought that it was a bit confusing.
It's probably more of an engineering thing outside my area, but I do recall during the Transport Asset Management Plan presentation that Bradley had said that part of that climate change response was that the walls may not be higher yet, but the way that they're building the base and the foundation of those walls is that they can be extended into the future. So they're sort of future-proofing the assets that are there now and enabling that to happen in the future without building them higher prior to it being required.
Can we just touch base and just do a little bit of extra work to make sure that assumption makes sense in the context of that work? Thank you.
Right, thank you, Councillor Condi. Councillor Foon.
Good afternoon. Just thinking about the venues particularly, because in the LTP, there's a lot of money around what we're asking for venues. And the venues report came out in 2019, is that's right? So pre-COVID. So how would we, just how confident are we around what we're looking to invest in the venues, given that the report came out before COVID? Is this,
Yeah, I couldn't speak specifically. Are you talking about the earthquake strengthening costs of venues?
I guess more around having so many when there's still a COVID risk and those big gathering of events, and given that projections are looking good, but we've got a short-term question mark over a lot of activity in the future, even though we don't want it, but we're going to have a surplus of venues compared to what we have now. So just where is the confidence there?
Well, I guess the projections have been taking into account the rolling program of earthquake strengthening, and therefore the revenues and business activity coming out of those venues is variable over those years that earthquake strengthening is happening. So I guess we're saying with the forecasts that they're reliable given the information that we have when those venues are available to open, and that the business activity will resume when they do open. And I guess the economic forecasts will sort of aid that.
All right, is that it from you, Councillor Foon? Yeah. Okay, moving on then to Councillor Pennant.
Thank you very much for doing this work, and I find looking at the assumptions incredibly useful. Could I just ask my first two questions to Inframetrics? I'm really pleased that they were able to come. Otherwise, it's a wasted afternoon, Brett.
I'll take the broad question, then if I need technical advice from the team, I'll call back, if that's all right.
Okay. My favourite topic, and in fact, I think I'm still waiting an email from you, Brad. Climate change. It's in fact, I think there's only one very light mention of it there, and I just was curious as to why it was given such a light touch.
In general, because in a sense, our economic forecasts take into account current trends and settings. Now, at the time, there hasn't been too much of a move in terms of what the specific outcomes for New Zealand will be in the climate change space. So, I mean, yes, we now have, of course, the budgets that have come out and similar since this report has been provided. But outside of that, there's no sort of firm expectation on the changes. We do have built in, for example, into our macroeconomic forecasts, shifts in terms of electricity generation over a longer period, but that does take a while to come in. So it's not specifically accounted for, given that our report at the moment is on current expectations, and in a sense, we'd be unwise as economic forecasters to do much more than that, and we take the current settings and then evaluate what they're likely to do. So a change in circumstance outside of the current economic parameters, so either from council itself, from central government or outside, will change the forecast track.
And you'll have had this one before, but how accurate is forecasting? Because I understand that economists were a bit surprised by the fall in unemployment. So how much credibility does some of these in a genuine way? I mean, just
it's a fair question. It's absolutely a fair question.
Is it sort of magic or arts or science?
It's not quite dark science. Look, so a few points that I'll probably put forward. In the sense that I guess because council must rely on forecasts, everyone out there will give you a similar sort of forecast. So there's comparability across forecasts, and that we expect a hit, which we've seen, and then a bit of a bounce back. Now the timing in that is the key question there. As we get better information, we will of course and have of course assessed that. In speaking to that, the forecasts at the moment remain uncertain. I think that's sort of highlighted throughout the report, that they remain quite conditional on the assumptions that we've made, which is sort of interesting because we make assumptions for our forecast report, which informs your key forecasting assumptions, which dictate how your LTP comes out. I'm not going to lie, they are uncertain given the pathway forward. But I guess reading them through the context of our assumptions, you'll get a better read for how likely they are to come by. I say that in the sense that if, for example, we have a Trans-Tasman bubble that opens sooner or a faster resumption of international tourism at some point, then you can guess that our forecast will be too pessimistic, and you, in a sense, can adjust them in your head in terms of that there will be better economic times, if you will. Same for the downside broadly. On the unemployment rate, I guess one of the challenges that we've seen there as well with COVID, noting the uncertainty, is that the level of disruption has been quite different from just about any other economic crisis that we've seen before. And so we are trying to react relatively on the fly to businesses who are either looking to remove some of their employees but don't eventually end up firing their staff, and so trying to, I guess, pick through the entrails of intention versus reality at some points. So long story short, there is uncertainty, but we're confident of the pathway. What I would say in terms of the ability to use them and sort of how to inform your judgment is that we are much more confident on the sort of the trend pathway than, say, saying it will absolutely be 3.1% per annum growth in XYZ year. What we are picking in terms of the trend is that for Wellington particularly, we have seen strong job growth in the likes of the public service sector, but a downside risk on the tourism side. All up, that says that we are likely to have had a pretty hard hit already. That's been evident. We do expect a resumption of growth as we go forward. The first year will look really good on paper because it comes off a low base, and then a slightly steadier state out there. But I think, as well as mentioned in the report, there is always capacity constraints in there that will limit growth from just roaring away. In Wellington, that's around population limitations, building levels and similar.
Yeah, so I'm interested in the longer term forecasts. And then, okay, so thanks for that. And just to the officers, I do have a question about the assumptions around the asset valuations. Are you able to get some more information about what those assumptions are? So I think I can't remember who did those assumptions, whether again it was some economists, but I would like to look at them in a bit more detail.
Sure.
Yeah, okay, thanks very much.
We may have to sort of tighten up our timekeeping if we're going to have enough time for everything, but moving on, please take as much as you think you need. Councillor Matthews.
That's all right. Rebecca is my name. My first name is not councillor. Just a very quick one, and I guess possibly for Brad about, but others may answer about consents, because in the Infometrics report it talks about a positive outlook for consents, and I've seen some analysis of the last quarter of last year, which was Wellington was much, was dropped and was compared quite badly to other parts of the country. So I'm just kind of interested in that and what's kind of behind that very positive outlook.
Sorry to make continue backs. Yes, I think if we look at the current trend, it hasn't been quite as positive in the near term. I think part of that also probably looks at what is happening in the current environment. There's quite a lot of capacity pressures already in Wellington in the short term, and also that consents and that have a necessary lag time. I believe, and the team will be able to nod or shake their head, that we've also taken into account not the specifics, if you will, of any spatial plan changes and district plan changes, but that there will be changes in that regard, which will allow for additional capacity in the development space. Is that fair to say? Yep. So in a sense, not fantastic at the moment. Some of that is because we've got it. We do actually have a good pipeline. It's just a little bit sluggish at the moment. We would expect it to start accelerating once we're able to get a bit more of that capacity underway.
Thank you.
Thanks, Councillor Fitzsimons.
Yeah, I'm quite interested in the comments you made around housing, particularly describing the housing market as resilient, because I don't think the people that are desperately trying to find a house would quite describe it in the same way. But I guess what are you thinking in terms of the economic forecasting and how the council could intervene and address the actual lack of supply? So how does that kind of extrapolate out? And I've got another question.
I will try to keep that brief. The resilience comment, I think, is because in the sense that, yes, I note the position around affordability, but at the same time, a massive drop in house prices is actually not very good for the economy, given the number of people who leave without equity. Now, I'm not saying sort of homeowners or not. I'm just saying that's an economic point that it'd be better to grow supply and naturally be able to provide additional capacity. Around the sort of, what was the second part of the question? It was around supply, wasn't it?
Yeah, sort of market interventions.
Yeah, and I think a lot of that has to come down to both the infrastructure provision from our point of view in terms of actually getting available infrastructure to places. That's both new capacity but also sort of re-upped capacity for areas that are already using pipes that are too small and what have you, but just also providing for that densification. Now, part of that is council's work around spatial plan and similar. I do mean that quite seriously. Some research I think we're putting out later today, not for this, but more broadly highlights that those areas that have had a greater increase in new dwelling stock over the last 10 years have, funnily enough, had slightly slower price growth over the last 5-year period. Not rocket science, but it's nice to have some numbers. So I think the interventions are relatively well clear. It's also removing some of those barriers for development while protecting the ability for people to still have a say about their own community. I think there's a balance there. At the moment, it seems to be, if you will, Councillor, that everyone we talk to says that it's difficult to engage with building. It seems to be that no one feels that they are helped along the process. It's almost how many roadblocks can we be put up. Now, I'm not saying that specifically of Wellington. I'm just saying that's the general feel. So if there's motivations to be able to shift that, that's a market intervention that could help.
That's very helpful, thank you. And I'm also interested in a comment in the report around housing being overvalued relative to income, which is pretty obvious. But we've obviously got a massive infrastructure bill that we're facing, in this LTP. So what are the mechanisms that you would suggest to ensure that people who might have seen increasing house values and are going to have an increased rates bill, not necessarily aligned, but and are on fixed income. So are there sort of obviously we can, there are ways that we can cushion that in terms of how and when they pay their rates. So those sorts of things, are those effective and likely to be taken up in terms of market?
If I can just interrupt, I'm not quite sure this is really relevant to the assumptions in the paper. So I don't know if that's something that maybe you can take offline, or perhaps there can be a very brief answer provided, just pointing out that we still have Mayor Foster, Councillor Rush and Councillor Day needing to ask questions.
I'll answer very briefly.
Very
if that's
briefly,
all right,
if you don't mind.
I think there are different changes that can be made. I think at the same time that people on fixed incomes, actually very few people are on fixed incomes. Most incomes, including superannuation and otherwise, actually rise each year, not necessarily by the level of rates perhaps, but there are increases. Challenges, yes, but I think the other element is that at some point if you don't raise rates and you don't provide for that capex, then you're in a tougher place. But happy to follow up offline.
Okay, I agree, it's fascinating, but we just got a time frame. Sorry about that. Right, Mayor Foster.
Very quick questions. Clause 17 talks about $13.6 million loss from COVID, and I thought that might be the 2021 year rather than the 2021 and 2022 year. So have we actually got an actual loss of revenue from COVID? Because I mean, the airport alone will be that.
That is last year's loss.
Okay, so it might,
obviously it's still ongoing. So
cool. Okay, that's fine. Cool. Second one is there's some population numbers both in the front end report and then the assumptions, and they're different for 2020 and 2030. Is there a reason for that? Well, that's sort of vaguely pertinent to our spatial planning, of course.
Yes, so the population numbers in the appendix are from Forecast ID, which is our population provider, and those are the long-term growth projections. The ones that are in the report that Infometrics have provided are theirs, and they take, I suppose the ones in Forecast ID don't take account of COVID-19. The additional work that Infometrics did was some work to understand the impacts of COVID-19 and how they might affect, which I think basically showed a short downturn then rebound. And I suppose for the purposes of our long-term planning, the assumption is still those long-term growth projections, which align with our spatial planning. From
I was going to say, well, if you look at the 2030 numbers, one's 242,000, the other's 231,000. It's reasonably material.
Yes.
Yeah, I think we need to tidy ourselves up on that one. That's all I'm saying. Okay, there's an assumption there, page 18, about an MM1, I think it is, earthquake within 30 years, basically being the expectations. That's a sort of a moderate, what we would regard as a moderate level earthquake, sort of 7-ish type earthquake. Is that what we're assuming there?
Yeah, would be a 7, I think.
Yeah. Okay. Right. Cool. And then there's some numbers around CPI and interest rates. The interest rates at which we're borrowing at, I think it's page 22. They look quite high. They're sort of all in the 3s. Whereas I thought we were borrowing considerably less at a considerably lower rate than that. And if we feed 3% in and we're borrowing at a lower rate, actually we're charging ourselves. What's the story there?
Yep, so our weighted average cost at the moment is 3.1%. So we have over 70% of our debt is hedged. So we have a hedging program in line with our treasury management policy. And therefore, that hedging goes on for a number of years for all of those different interest rate swap instruments. And so what the forecast takes into account, that hedging program rolling off and then rolling on new debt at a lower rate. So it is coming down over time as our current hedging rolls off.
Doesn't particularly look like it's coming down. I see what it's doing a bit there. Yeah, so I mean, because obviously the expectation is to borrow a very significant amount of money, so you'd have thought it would change quite significantly. So what is our expectation of new borrowing, I guess?
Well, so at the moment, our net debt is around 720.
Sorry, the rate we expect to borrow at.
Yes, but what I'm trying to explain is that we've got $720 million worth of debt at the moment. 75% of that is hedged, and therefore, yes, while we are borrowing new money, it's against quite a large portfolio of hedged debt, and therefore the rate's not going to come down as fast with that new debt as you might imagine.
Yeah, if you can give me the rate offline of what you expect to borrow, fine.
Of the new debt?
Yep.
Yeah, it's, obviously it depends on the term and things, but it's around the 1.1% floating.
Yeah, I think it might be useful to say that. Okay, and the final thing there was the inflation rates. So that we've got some inflation rates there in the page above that for, hang on, sorry, it's the page before, for our water, etc. assets. So we're revaluing at 6% every year. I think that might be what you were asking, Councillor Condi. But we're revaluing at 6% every year. We're revaluing the treatment plant 8% every year. And yet on the page before that, the cost adjusters, now I know it's not quite the same things there, but they're way, way lower. And I just wondered what the relationship between those two tables was.
It's similar to my explanation earlier to Councillor Condi's question, which is that the cost adjusters affect, obviously, the material prices, the labour, and a component of that valuation, but there are a number of other factors in the valuation that aren't related to price indexation. For example, assumptions around the amount of assets that we own. So if we find new assets, that we didn't know we owned earlier, they will come into the revaluation, and therefore the value will go up significantly. It's got nothing to do with the price of.
That's fine. Yeah, I just want to make sure we were clear on that too. Cool, that's fine, thank you.
Can I just ask a question in here about sensitivity analysis? So obviously there are some uncertainties. Is that where sensitivity analysis can actually give you some confidence around how if things changed, you might be looking at slightly different results?
Yes, absolutely. And we will look at some sensitivity analysis in the workshop following this for some key factors.
It was a question I wondered in relation to some of what you were saying too, Brad. But moving on, we have Councillor Rush and then Councillor Day, and then I will hand over to Paige to introduce.
Thanks. It possibly might be better if I set this out in an email. There's some jiggery pokey going on with the sea level rise data, and I'm not sure if it's fair if I throw it at you. But the Ministry for Environment Guidance has sort of gone from being to 2100 to now 2120. The IPCC advice from 2014, which was based on 2010 numbers, which is what the MFE is on, is quite different to what we're now seeing at 2020. So, and then I've also, here in Wellington, the seismic changes have quite an impact. So we should really be customising that advice with some advice from GNS. So yeah, I mean, 2010 the advice was a metre by 2100. It now seems that it's that metre is going to happen in 2120 now. I guess the other thing is that the current rate is 22 centimetres a year, so it will be a massive change for that to.
Yeah, is there a question there, Councillor Rush? Just a point you want to make in debate. All right.
I'm setting out, I mean, just how robust are these numbers, and have you challenged them, and are we going to accept them? Because they are,
I think it is
simply right. And then where's the drought, the rainfall, and other numbers relating to climate change, or the indicators? I think the sea level rise thing's nonsense, and we need to go back.
Okay, well, we know your opinion, but you meant to be asking a question. So there was a question.
Okay,
should we let the officers answer?
How confident are you in the sea level rise data?
Okay.
I suppose the approach we've taken is to align as much as possible to the MFE guidance around sea level
and I get
rise.
that. Yeah. Well, we should challenge it.
Thank you. We'll move on to Councillor Day and Councillor Paul.
So on page 9, I think it's number 14, it's talking about COVID-19 and the future year, that our assumption is that we're not going to have a further lockdown. Is that correct? Because my understanding is from everything that I've read is that if we have another lockdown, the impacts will be greater than the last one we had. So we're being quite bold, not assuming we're not going to have another one. How do we make that assumption?
It's probably worth noting that within all of these, and this sort of comes back to the sensitivity, if you will, that's not the central scenario at the moment, particularly given New Zealand's health response and that we have a vaccine and such on the way. Now, I'm totally not putting it offhand, and you're probably right that if we did have one, it would be a harder hit. Businesses have sort of used their reserves, people have used their reserves in a sense. But I think at the moment our central forecast scenario, and obviously what Council's taking there, is that that's not what we currently expect. It's sort of like to the same point. Obviously, the risk is different, but the risk of a meteor strike is certainly in there. It's just a very low risk, high impact event, but low risk in the immediate sense. So our feeling is that that's not the current expectation, if you will, at least for the central pathway. Yep.
Thank you. And finally, Councillor Paul.
Kia ora. I was just wondering, in terms of those climate change assumptions, I was really interested to see that it doesn't really factor in, and maybe this is just the way that you do this, but it doesn't really factor in some of the legislative changes that the government has committed to. And it's only really the natural impacts of climate change, but what about the kind of policy and legislative environment that we have to operate in? Do we make assumptions on that, or is that something that you don't do because it's political and might change if the government changed or...
I can answer that at a very high level, which is really these assumptions are for the businesses planning that where climate change is going to impact those business plans. We also have challenges in the strategy around climate change and therefore the council's response to that. So as we're building up the budget, there are specific projects and specific funding that are responding to climate change. And these assumptions probably don't lead into that as much as they do into the planning of things like seawalls and how we're going to respond with our business as usual.
And Councillor Fitzsimons has another question she promised.
Yeah, sorry, I got
to be
mixed
very
up about
short.
which paper was which. I do have a question. It's to our council officers, and it's around the Three Waters reform. And the assumption is that we assume that we carry on and budget and use existing arrangements over the 10 years of the long-term plan, even though we know very clearly that there's going to be signalled from government that there will be reform in this area. And I'm seeing here it says it's based on the Society of Local Government Managers advice. I thought it was based on DIA advice, and I'm a lot more comfortable with DIA than I am with this local government managers outfit. So which is it, or is it both?
So I can answer that. So it's probably a miswording. I have to re-look at it. But the Solgum advice is around the wording to put into the LTP around the uncertainty of the water reforms going ahead. So we don't know what shape it's going to take yet. We have to participate in that process and go through that process to find out what it's going to be. Because that is so uncertain about how that's going to end up, then we plan for business as usual carrying on, and the advice of the wording has come from Solgum, not the advice of the process of going through the water reform, which is led by DIA.
To clarify, if I may, through you, Chair, that advice has also been set in consultation with DIA. So DIA have been consulted in putting that advice together, and that's gone out to all the territorial authorities.
Is it the advice that we plan as if it's not happening? Or is it just the advice that you note it?
The advice is that you plan as if it's not happening.
Really? Seems very conservative.
Yep. Thank you, colleagues. It's been a great round of questions. I would like to now hand over to Mayor Foster to actually introduce the paper.
Thanks, Madam Chair. Just a few quick words. First of all, this is something we're required to have. And it's actually really, really important that we do our planning on the basis that we actually do have some assumptions about the environment we operate in. It's a very clear paper. It's great to have the professional support there from good to see you, Brad, and all the sort of guises that you attend this table, but to have that professional support from Infometrics. What is critical to understand, I think, is that these are the assumptions. Probably the reality is that the world will not be exactly as assumed. In fact, we know that it won't be exactly as assumed. It's just how far out it will be in some of those areas. But this is the best estimate of what will happen. So, for example, take the question of a COVID lockdown situation again. Look, the likelihood is, and we've got a forecast on that basis that it won't happen. If it does happen, it will change a lot of things in the next year, and obviously there'll be a fair few bets which will be off. So we need to be wise to those, and that's part of the conversation which we're going to have later on today, which is if some of those assumptions, what are the risks if some of those assumptions don't happen? If we get a COVID lockdown, if we've got an earthquake, if something major happens, and that's why, for example, in our debt profile, we need to take the earthquake situation. We need to keep a headroom there if something goes wrong, because we will need that headroom to be able to have our city recover. The reality is we do live in particularly uncertain times. COVID is certainly not something that anybody saw coming, but we are now with it, and we need to get through that, so we need to bear that in mind. There is a clear expectation of a decline in economic activity over the next year. It's certainly been pointed out that particularly areas in the hospitality, the tourism sectors will feel some pain probably after we've stopped our holidays, because there is no international tourism which normally would be there in the latter part of our summer and into autumn. So we know that's the expectation before the economy starts to recover. So it's not a bad news thing, but it is just one to say, just be careful with what we're doing, and it means we know that we need to support our economy in every way that we possibly can. Having said that, the economy, I think it'd be fair to say, is performing better across the country than was expected. If you go back to March, April, May, June last year, the expectation was much, much darker than what we've actually seen. So that is really good news for New Zealand. But what we do know still is that the world economy, notwithstanding that we've got vaccines, beginning to be rolled out, the world economy is going to have done it much, much tougher than we have, because it's when you talk to friends and relations overseas and they have not been to work in months and months and months and months. They've been working from home. It is tough. So we've just got to bear that in mind, and they are our trading partners and they are our tourists as well. So we've got to bear that one in mind. So look, I'm happy to move the paper. It's an important part of our background. Just the one other thing I would say is that I know that in the past, I look here at Councillor Calvert, the external members of the Finance Audit and Risk Committee have often said, look, if there's any value that we can add to your long-term plan, it's not making political decisions, but it is looking at the assumptions and saying, well, let's cast our eye over them and see whether there's any comments that they might make. And I would suggest that's probably a useful thing to do. So happy to move.
Do you have a seconder, Mayor Foster?
So Condi appears to have seconded.
We will second it. Councillor Condi, do you wish to speak now? Reserve your right. Is there any other debate? Councillor Calvert.
Not really a debate, but just a follow-on comment from the Mayor, that noting that, yes, we will invite our external members of Finance, Audit and Risk to look at these. I think it's important. One of the part of the role of Finance, Audit and Risk is to provide confidence to the Council that they're in the LTP process. And as part of the LTP process is that we have good forecasting assumptions. Obviously, Audit New Zealand, our auditor, would also be casting their eye over this just to make sure that that we've captured all the main ones and articulated them in the right way. So this is not the end of the forecasting assumptions. I think this has still got a few checks and balances to go through before, as it's noted in recommendation 2, it's presented alongside the LTP consultation document. So,
thank you for that. Councillor Rush.
Thank you. Yes, I'll support this paper, despite reservations that I've already mentioned, and I've got some hesitancy on the population growth forecast too. The reality is, though, that as Councillor Calvert says, there's a long way to go, but in any event, a conservative approach is always warranted by a state's player, so I'm happy to go along with that.
Thank you. Is there any further debate? Councillor Pennant.
Look, just really briefly, I'd like to thank staff again, even though it was a requirement. I think it really is healthy to lay this all out carefully so that people can actually see whether we've got it right or not. And that's often been our problem as environmentalists, is that the assumptions weren't spelt out, and then it makes it very hard to make the necessary policy change. Look, obviously there's some good news in there, so that's to be celebrated, but I possibly am still a little bit concerned that we haven't taken long-term risks into account, and I thank you, Councillor Paul, for your question, that the way that we are understanding climate change probably needs to be some more development in the way that economists and policymakers actually look at those long-term risks. Just the other thing is, I guess, with the assets and the quality of our assets, I hope that information is correct, because, we've been told things in the past and then we've found out some other things. So I'll be interested just to look at a little bit more information. But I do think it's healthy, and obviously it's a baseline, and then we can amend them as necessary as new information comes to light.
Thank you, Councillor Pennant. Did I see someone's hand up there? Councillor Fitzsimons.
Yeah, just briefly. I think one of the things we do need to keep in mind is the other work that the council's doing. So like the forecasting assumptions forecast, a resilient housing market, but also a housing market that I think they describe it as not overvalued relative to income. So it's not, and we I think we do need to be really clear with the community that we're aware of these forecasts and that we will be taking an active role in trying to address it. So I think it's quite good to note the other areas of work that the council's doing so that the LTP isn't seen in isolation from the spatial plan and our apartment conversions and perhaps a more active role in the housing market. I also want to see some really robust advice around how we can support business in the city. So what are the practical ways that a council can support business to be strong in a post-COVID era? And I would also like to challenge this assumption that we can't take any account of the upcoming Three Water reform from government. And I'd really like to see the details of this advice between DIA and Solgum and whether we've tried to get tried to get movement on that, or whether LG and Z have, because it's going to compromise our ability to invest in other ways if we can't at least partly anticipate that this is coming in some way. So I'd really like to unpick that. And look, it might just be that that's not possible and that that's an accounting assumption, but I want to understand it better than I do now. And whether there is any movement there, because investment in core infrastructure has to be a priority. But as soon as we close our eyes to the Three Water reforms, I think we compromise our ability to solve other challenges facing the city. So I'm really keen to understand that and really scrutinise that piece of advice.
Thank you. And Councillor, there was somebody else. Who was it? Or is that it? I have to ask. Yeah. Just prior to that, I was going to just make a quick comment myself, and my comment was really around the economic recovery by 2022. I found that good news, but I wondered how robust that was going to be when we're just seeing the likes of some of our retailers really struggling. So, but I do take some comfort in the idea of sensitivity analysis and also looking at what sort of shocks we might face. So I'm happy to support this paper. I note that it's going to come back following audit, so then I guess that means we may expect some minor changes, or maybe some changes anyway. And I'll hand over to Councillor Condi for her seconding.
Thank you. Just kind of wanted to address again the water revaluations and the fact that we've got them down as kind of 6% annually and then 8% annually across the treatment plants. But in the recent revaluation we had, and I believe that we actually ended up with the revals going up over 30% over the 3 years. So I still want to dig into that and understand why, recently, recent historic trends has been revals are at 10%, but we're now forecasting out in the future that it's going to be 6 and 8. So that's another area I'd like to make sure I understand a bit better. And just wanted to come back to the climate change thing. I think the comment about carbon price, I think, is a really good one, because we had this conversation about the landfill the other day, and carbon price is going to become more and more important in a lot of our other areas. We talk about our park, sport and rec, as we build carbon sinks and all those sorts of things. That might be something that would be useful if we do have a kind of standard set of assumptions. It would be nice to have it in here, so that we can kind of see that that's also built in. The other thing, and this is just a kind of personal bugbear that I have, but around the climate change, and I see Alison sitting there, maybe whether we could have a conversation about whether we've got the language quite right. We talk about the level of sea level rise change is uncertain, but sometimes I think it's actually more useful to think about it as the speed or timing of change is uncertain. As I understand the science, a certain amount of sea level rise is already baked in. We just don't know how fast it's going to happen. So, I don't know what that number actually is, but we kind of know that there will be at least, imagine, 50 centimetres. No matter what we do from this point on, there will be at least 50 centimetres of sea level rise. We don't know whether that's 50 years away or 100 years away or 150 years away or 25 years away. So I just think that sometimes thinking about it as slower and faster and thinking about the timing rather than the level can actually be a bit more helpful, that language, in terms of how we think about our asset management plans. So that's just throwing that into the conversation.
Thank you, Councillor Condi. Mayor Foster, did you wish to have a right of reply?
Yeah, just very quickly, just to pick up a few things that various speakers have said. Councillor Pannett, risks not fully taken into account? Quite possibly. Which means, can I encourage you, when you think about how much you wish to spend and how much you wish to borrow, to be more cautious than you might otherwise be likely to do so? Councillor Fitzsimons, look, I can completely agree. The whole thing about the long-term plan is it's not sitting in isolation. It is not merely a budget. It is much more than the budget. It's got to be seen in the context of it, and it provides the resources for the work that we do across all these different areas, and of course it needs to talk to all the different areas of the work that we do. So completely support that. And in that there will be, the way we support business. There'll be other things that are not necessarily directly within the LTP, but, for example, the fact that we will be doing an economic development strategy, we can reference that, but obviously that work will happen outside and alongside the LTP. The three water reforms is an interesting one. I've actually raised that question of, if we are likely to see the three water asset, or at least two of them, if not all three, owned by some other entity, either the assets off our balance sheet and owned by some other entity, even if whether we're a shareholder or not. But at the moment, the clear instruction is that we stay business as usual. That when we know the shape of the reforms, that then we can adjust that. But that would be a pretty major adjustment. We will need every council up and down the country will be asked to consult with its community about those reforms this year. So we can have those discussions at that point in time. And Councillor Condi, can I just encourage you to continue to pursue those issues of the understanding around the revaluations, because I share that issue of trying to make sure that we don't end up with, as we did this year, with that sort of that lift which is bigger than we expected in terms of revaluations, because that goes straight to the rates line, and likewise with carbon prices. Let's just try and get the assumptions as right as we can, and some of these things will keep on changing. It's a dynamic environment.
Okay, so the motion has now been put and seconded. We've had debate. We'll now vote on it. So those in favour, please press number 1, the green. Those against, the red. 2. Yes, we're voting. Moving on to our second paper, the one about the community, where is it? The long-term phase 1, the engagement paper. Can we please have, thank you, got lovely Amy, Lloyd and Baz again. Is one of you likely to just give us a little bit of a brief overview, and then we can have a round of questioning, and then we'll again have debate.
Thank you, councillors. Good afternoon. As you're all aware, the long-term plan, one of the key inputs into that is the community outcomes framework, and you had a number of workshops in Q3 of last year where you worked through a number of components of that, and out of that came a framework which we then took as part of pre-engagement and tested it out with the public itself. That's required. We're required to do that by statute, and we're also required to bring into that the community well-beings within that, which is one of the aspects of the work that you did in those workshops themselves. The draft framework, as I said, has been tested as part of pre-engagement, and I'll let Amy just talk to that in a moment. But as at a high level, overall, the community engagement on this document didn't result in any huge material structural change to the document. There was, however, fine-tuning to it. So I guess to a large extent you got it right. The other aspect of that is the outcomes framework obviously goes to the heart of your role as governors of this organisation, and the direction setting it provides within the LTP as it's been a long-term plan itself. So we recognise that your ownership of these of this framework is very important, and the words are therefore important as well. You've already, I think, provided to us some suggested amendments to that, and that's just fine. We've actually incorporated some of those already, and no doubt there'll be a bit more. I'll just make the point that also when these are brought together into the final LTP document, there will be an additional narrative sitting around this framework as well, which will amplify those to some extent as well, and we'll be bringing that back to you as part of the process as well. So at this point, this paper asks you to let us continue on with the development of the LTP using the framework as we have, recognising that in fact we are incorporating and we will incorporate other tweaks that you may have, and as we go through the engagement process, there may well be some feedback we get from the community in terms of formal engagement. Just in terms of what we covered in engagement, I'll leave Amy just to talk you through at a high level now.
Thank you, kia ora, councillors. So the pre-engagement phase we've been running since about November last year has been, I think, quite successful. The public overall really appreciated us talking to them with essentially quite a blank slate of just a very high-level overview of what they actually thought and telling us what they thought was important. And especially when people said, "Oh, well, what do you think what's in it for us?" And we're actually able to say, "There isn't. You are now here to tell us what should be in it for you." And that seemed to be quite powerful for them to have the input at this very early stage. As the report states, water and housing were very top of mind for the public, and that is basically supported what was in that draft framework. So that came through in all of the methods of engagement that we have done, and ones with key stakeholders in the different sectors, business, arts, etc., and also just when we had touch points with the general public. It was quite a light touch engagement. We didn't do a lot of big push advertising, or we didn't go to every single event possible, and purely that's because we knew we had done stuff over the past 3 years that could also impact on this, and so part of it was going back and looking at some of those recent engagements and mining them for information that people have already told us on this community framework. So that's sort of why it was a bit lighter touch. And then obviously going forward, this then informs the next part of the formal consultation process in April. So it's also quite, I think, powerful for the community knowing that when we're going into that formal consultation period and we've got a consultation document, they've already had some kind of input into that process. Yeah. Anyway, happy to take questions.
Thank you. I think, have I got one from you, Councillor Day?
Kia ora, thank you. The engagement was really good. I was lucky to go and attend one, and it was quite interesting to see people working through the challenges of juggling it. But you're right, there were some very clear decisions made very quickly. And so thank you to the team for what they did, because it's good to see that was kind of initially done. And the report is really helpful, and the strategic objectives, the framework is really helpful for us to see it laid out there. One thing's just jumped out at me in the framework, which I think is probably something we can just change. It says strong partnerships with mana whenua weaving te reo, which is, that statement itself is good, but I just wonder if we should change mana whenua to Māori, because obviously Māori incorporates mana whenua as well, and whether there is a way that we can weave it together with both. But I just think if we say mana whenua, then we're actually really limiting who we interact with. So I'm sure that you can do that. I don't need to do an amendment or anything, but yeah. It's easy to kind of get the two kind of interchanging, and then we kind of don't realise sometimes what that can mean.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, because all of parts of this won't get sort of finalised until June. So yeah, if there are wording changes that have the agreement of the table, we're happy to incorporate those as we go through.
I don't think anyone will object to that being changed yet. Cool.
Wonderful. Is Councillor? Oh, sorry, I actually had Mayor Foster and then Councillor Paul.
Okay. So look, you've seen obviously some suggested circulated amendments. Now those are amendments, if I'm being correct, there to pay the what's on page 74, at least 74 on my document. Is that correct? The priority objectives. Okay, so look, the one I'm just interested in, which is, sent back an email saying the one thing that's kind of missing for me in that is the actual natural environment, and the two parts of that, the natural environment and the attractiveness of the city. So and it's how we best fit those concepts into there, particularly with the natural environment. That's quite clearly come through very strongly as a priority for from the community feedback. But that kind of concept doesn't quite fit there. It's kind of left out of that. So I wondered what your best way of putting that in there will be.
As I said, we're happy to take any feedback, and if you just let me know how we can.
Right, it's just a matter of how that gets wordsmithed, and if people are comfortable with doing that, I'm very happy to do that. Yeah.
The idea with the priorities was ones that the community had wanted to see. Like looking back in 3 years, wanted to see change on in that 3 years, and I think that had also come through in the councillor workshops that were done. The reason at the moment why natural environment isn't in there is because that was one that people recognised as that we were doing a lot of work in already, and that was already having a lot of change over towards like a 30-year time frame. So that wasn't one that they necessarily said council needed extra focus on or a more bigger lens.
So the focus we've already got on, which is a focus of change, because it's not a business as usual focus. I mean, you know, the decisions we made, you know, that we're making right now, and the decision, and obviously the work that's being done in the likes of Predator Free, those are not business as usual decisions. So what you're saying is that the trajectory is improvement like that. You just keep on doing the improvement like that rather than change the angle of the improvement.
Exactly. Yeah.
Okay, so we're looking to change the, if you like, the angle, the trajectory of improvement on things. That's why they're there. So that's why transport or housing or whatever.
Exactly correct. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Not saying that's not going to be improved. Just those are the ones. Yeah. Exactly. The trajectory.
If we can put it in that context, then I'm okay with that. But if it gets lost, I wouldn't be so happy.
Yeah. We can do that. Yeah.
All right, Councillor Paul. Are there any further questions? One from you, and after that I'll hand over to the Mayor.
So I'm just having a look at the priority objectives for the next 3 years. So did they come from the engagement process?
So they first came from councillors, and then they were tested with the community.
Yep.
Essentially, the zero carbon, mana whenua, and the affordable and resilient housing were all already there. The other three were rolled up into one objective, and that we just split out into three, essentially.
Yeah.
That's the change.
Because I noticed that visibility of Te Reo and Tau Māori, although receiving the most number one rankings, also received the most last place rankings. It shows quite a polarisation, which we see in Wellington and elsewhere. So I was just wondering why that got there, but it got there because of my colleagues, I'm guessing. So all good.
Right. Mayor Foster, would you like to introduce this paper?
Yeah, look, very, very briefly, because I think, in a sense, there's some wording changes which I will move as the substantive. So perfectly happy with those. Officers are also happy with those. The only thing is just to reiterate, as I said just now, that I'm very anxious that we don't forget that the trajectory of continued improvement that we make in the natural environment is part of that, and also that we make sure that as we do the development of the city, that we're also looking after the place itself, because I think that's something that's very, very important to people, that we don't just go and, grow it or put transport through it. And that's one of the things which we've had advice that the place is important. It's not just getting there if it's a transport thing, and it's not just, it's not just we built more houses, but we actually done them in a way which keeps the city being attractive. So those are key things to me.
And
so happy to move. And just to say, look, thank you to the staff for all the work in getting us this far with this particular part of the long-term plan development. I guess it was really nice to hear that, basically speaking, we are on the right track. So we're not as far away from what our community wants as some people would sometimes have us believe.
That's true. And I think strong indication there that Councillor Matthews would welcome seconding this paper. Would you like to?
Yes, I would like to. And I guess, this was quite affirming for me, the results of the engagement, because, as you know, I'm completely obsessed with housing, and I'm a bore, and I find I'm not alone, that Wellingtonians are also obsessed with housing in our city. And the huge risk that being able to achieve so much in our city if we don't sort out housing is, it's really top of my mind. And the other thing I want to thank my colleagues for the word changes, which are really good, including Councillor Condi, to talk about housing specifically. It's not just somewhere to live, it's, the actual dwelling. But also the support you have for putting accessibility into a much higher profile. And I think that over the course of this long-term plan, it's really connected to the issue of housing and also transport, that there's so much more that we can do, but to sort of put it, sort of front and centre into the sort of city we want. So, and I just want to thank officers for their work. I also, got the opportunity to participate in some of the community engagement, and it was really well done, I think, and creative, and it was great. So yes, fantastic. Really happy with that, with the outcomes as drafted.
Thank you. I've got Councillor Pennant. And okay. Sorry about that. Yes, we can. Anyway, we have them now, and they are
pretty minor.
They are tweaks rather than major changes. That's not to say they don't matter, but
when you read it.
So I would like to invite Councillor Pennant to have her say.
So, not just being a little bit frank, there's been obviously some robust discussions in public around council, and so I'd just like to take this opportunity to really thank staff for this fantastic piece of work. It actually feels that people have really been listened to. It's the change that some of us have been working for a really long time. Climate change is in there, sustainability is in there, waste is in there, the rights of disabled people. Thank you, Councillor Matthews. We've got that right in there. Mana whenua, making sure that actually is a serious priority. So there's some really, really great stuff in here, and that will obviously, we'd love to see the spending decisions reflected as a result of those outcomes. And Mayor Foster, I am happy to spend some money because there is a lot of need. So, and as well as making some money off waste. So I just, I really appreciate the staff's work on this, and obviously also appreciative of the community for all the work that they have done. Just briefly on the changes, some of which I've worked on, I just want to always make it clear that when we're talking about the economy, we are also talking about a sustainable economy. Let's please not have artificial divisions between different parts of our city, and making sure that we really make it clear that we want a climate-friendly city as well. Upholding te tiriti is obviously absolutely critical, so thank you, Councillor Paul, for that suggestion. So I think this is really positive, and look forward to debating the budget when it eventually comes to us.
Thank you, Councillor Pennant. Councillor Calvert.
I'm just going to bring everybody back down to earth. Surprisingly. I know. So as we're waiting for our Christmas presents, what we want to achieve sometimes is what can we afford. So I think we're going to have some. This is all nice at the moment, and I think it's good to have some priorities. But the hard decisions are still to be made, because what we might like when we're using ratepayers and other people's money. I think we just need to sort of think about what we can actually afford. We're going to have a tough budget coming up. We've got lots more expenses, what people expect from core services from a council, and that's what they want to see. So I just want to bring people back down to earth slightly. Thank you.
All right, thanks for that. Councillor O'Neill, and then I've got Councillor Fitzsimons. I'll put myself on the speaking order after that too. Oh, and Councillor Rush. So Councillor, and Conti. All right, Councillor O'Neill.
I was going to say, Madam Chair, you could actually exercise the right. Does anybody wish to speak against it? Councillor Day said a very fine tone.
Can we keep it quite brief though? Because it's important. I think it is important that we do have a say if we need to, but can we just be aware of time?
3. Mine's very quick, and it is just purely to the purpose of talking about how awesome it was to see our engagement team and our staff out at Pacifica Festival, and to acknowledge the work of all the advisory groups. I know personally during Pacifica Festival, a whole bunch of different communities come together. Everybody was there from PAG at their own individual stores, but Jocelyn, the chair of the Pacifica Festival, spent her whole day at the Wellington City Council stall and talking to people in Samoan. Our team have done a fantastic job translating the document into key Pacifica language, and I just really wanted to acknowledge how awesome that was to see and how many more conversations we are able to have. And I know how hard our team has worked, and just the fact that, you know, our officers are out there doing shifts on Saturdays like they were doing excellent engagement with the spatial plan. They did a lot of extra work with this other stuff here, so I'll just leave it there.
We've got Councillor Fitzsimons.
Yeah, I wasn't going to speak, but I just want to briefly pick up on comments from the Mayor and Councillor Calvert, because I think we do need to spend. We need to spend more than ever before, because we've seen the impacts of the culture of austerity, which is the kind of suggestion that they were saying, that we need to be careful around spending.
Point of order, I was not suggesting anything about austerity or not spending at all. Thank you.
Well, in any case,
just make your points, Councillor Fitzsimons.
Yes, those are my points. Is that the restrictions on spending in the interests of this city is what has got us into this mess. And I will be supporting significant increased spending on core infrastructure, which is absolutely critical for Wellington.
And point of order, I just want to clarify, I did not mention anything about restrictions.
I think sometimes it's helpful just, if we just concentrate on what we want to say without too much reference to other members. Right, moving on. Councillor Rush.
Yeah, so I also like to commend officers for putting together well, first of all, for doing an amazing job out in the community and with us. And I was pretty comfortable with the way that the report was drafted, and just looking at page 73, paragraph 18, that provided the results of overall importance: reliable drinking, wastewater, stormwater, accessible and green spaces, reliable modern transport networks, affordable places to live. And I thought that the sort of summary, and that was in Appendix 1, sort of did that. I have to say that the additions proposed by my colleagues does not really reflect those key objectives. Things like upholding the Treaty of Waitangi, which is how most people would refer to it, that's, first of all, it's a Crown obligation. You know, how does that affect people? It's very, very controversial. It's exactly what that means. And some of the other things I think I'm comfortable with, but it's hard to see because I can't see the whole lot of it. But I did, you know, there were basically their opportunities being taken by colleagues to insert their own agendas, which is fine, but doesn't reflect what the community has said in those 4 overall importance results on page 73. So if you want to take each one of the amendments separately, then happy to do that. Otherwise, I won't be supporting the paper.
Okay, so what I take it where we've got to is we need to vote collectively. We can't take this by leave of the meeting. So, oh, okay. All right. Okay, that's fine. It's Councillor Rush's right to make his own voting decisions, but it has been moved as part of the substantive, so that is what's on the table. Thank you, Councillor Rush. Councillor Conti. And then I think we may be just about there. Who else is on the speaking list?
Day was before me, so.
Okay.
Do you want to go?
Sorry, I might have missed a few. Councillor Day, and I've got Councillor Sparrow. Okay.
You go then. All right.
All right, Councillor Conti. We'll do this. Councillor Conti, Councillor Day, and Councillor Sparrow. And are there any others? All right, please try and keep it brief, because we do want to have a break and then we want to have a workshop.
There are 2 things, just 2 points that I wanted to make. The first is that I think that this is a really important paper, and that I think it's important that we keep referring back to it as we start to make our actual spending decisions. I know that I will be, in terms of looking at looking back at these priority objectives and looking back at the feedback we've got from the community to help drive these really difficult decisions, because the community have made the effort to make trade-offs and say what they think their priorities are. So I think it's important as we go through the spending, our spending decisions, that we come back to this, and I certainly will be. I just wanted to acknowledge around the debates about spending. I think everybody understands that it's going to cost a lot of money to fix the pipes, and I don't think there's anybody here who doesn't think we should thinks we should just leave them as they are. One of the things I think that I learned when I was looking, working on the task force is that there's certainly a lot of political pressure in the past to keep rate rises under 5%, just because of the view of it, the public's appetite for those things. That's quite different to the situation we're in this year, where we are now coming up against our hard borrowing limits that are set by our external bankers, basically. So I think there are two things at play here. I think absolutely we're going to have to spend more money. Nobody thinks we aren't. The community said the top two priorities are fix the pipes at affordable housing, and we certainly know fix the pipes isn't going to be cheap. But we are still going to have to make some pretty difficult decisions if we want to be prudent and stay within these real borrowing limits that we face. So I think there is going to be plenty of interesting conversations over the next little while.
Thank you. Councillor Day.
Kia ora. And I just want to say I am really encouraged by the community feedback. I think the councillor workshops were really clear with the direction, and the community have also been really clear with us. And I'm not entirely surprised by the feedback we got around mana whenua te reo. If you consider that we are still not yet, we're very close to teaching New Zealand history in schools. Most of us have not grown up learning the impacts of colonisation. And also you don't need to stand up. It's not in the curriculum.
Sorry, but I'm not going to uphold that, and I wish to just carry on.
Thank you. But regardless of that, we do have an obligation to Te Tiriti o Waitangi. We wouldn't be here without Te Tiriti o Waitangi. We wouldn't be legitimate without it. So actually we do have a responsibility to uphold it, and I completely refute anyone who says that we don't. I also just want to support other councillors who have said that they are focused on making sure that we are meeting our needs as far as our investment in our infrastructure, and not holding back and saying we need to be frugal, because the reality is that has been suggested around this table, whether the word austerity was used or not. Those implications of those comments are saying that we are going to have to pick and choose. There are some things that we do not have options on, and it is going to be expensive, and I am open to investing in that, because I know in 10 years' time we will be hearing about it if we haven't invested in it. So let's just get on to it. And I thank you, Councillor Condi, you're right, we do need to keep this with us the whole way, because it's actually a really good guiding document. So thank you, and thank you officers for all your work over the summer. So thank you for that.
Thank you. And Councillor Sparrow.
I was just wondering whether there need to be clarification on the last phrase there, restore the city's connection with Papatūānuku, because perhaps the average person on the street knows what that means, but I have no idea.
Okay. Okay.
I could do that, but we should be clear, should we not, on phrases we use.
Okay. Perhaps staff could consider whether it could have some clarification in brackets, but it will let us leave that perhaps to the staff.
Can I have clarification right now? What is it?
Mother Earth.
Earth. Mother Earth. Mother Earth. Nature. Mother Earth. Okay. With that, I'm going to actually hand over to the Mayor to introduce the paper.
3 or 4 different comments to make. The first one of them is, look, thank you all for your strong support of the work that officers have done. And I do note that that work that officers have done is public facing, and it means that the officers have been engaging with our community on our behalf. And I also, that's obviously been something that has been said recently, questioning whether officers should be doing that. You've all just said that they should be. So thank you for those comments, and please bear those in mind as we go forward. This is a team job. This is a team job, and the team is 1,800 odd staff and the 15 of us, all of us together. We all have different roles in doing that, but we all are doing that together on behalf of our city. Thank you particularly, I thought, Councillor O'Neill, the comments you made around Jocelyn's efforts at the Pacifica Festival. Brilliant, fantastic work. So it's great to get that kind of feedback. Now, a number of you have made comments about austerity or non-austerity. The reality is, and we have clearly signalled it, that we are going to be spending more this year, significantly more this year. The question we've got to be answerable to our community about is where we spend that money. And I think they've been quite clear that the number one priority they have is to make sure that our infrastructure is in good shape and that pipes are not bursting all over the place. It's going to take some time to get there because it's a massive job. to catch that up. And those of you who've said, not enough was allocated in the past, I think quite right. So we have learned that at our cost, and we are going to fix that. The challenge we've got, and I think Councillor Condie summed it up very, very well, is that doesn't mean everything goes. It doesn't mean we can do everything all at once. In fact, our bankers will tell us we cannot. We will run straight through our banking covenants if we try and do that, and that we cannot do. So, and we also need, which is why I made the comment earlier in the earlier discussion, we also need to make sure that we have headroom if something goes wrong. So if there were a major earthquake, we know that we are not, we cannot get full insurance now. So if there is a major event, we are going to have to pick up some of the tab, and that's even after government's come to deal with the pipes, which they've been able to deal with some of the pipes post-Kaikoura. But we haven't managed to work out how to build them for that. But the point I'm making is, yes, we are going to be spending more. Yes, we are going to be investing more in our city, but it is not without limit. Our community has a limited ability to pay, and our bankers will have limited tolerance for us with us if we do that. So I hope that is clear that it's not about austerity. It is about investing, but it is not about anything goes. And then finally, I think I probably ought to, and actually thank you, Councillor Sparrow, for, two other points. Councillor Condie, yes, a very important paper to refer back to. I will refer back to it too, but I'm doing it with that rider that I did get the assurance that the business as usual trajectory around the natural environment is particularly going to be looked after. And the final one, Councillor Sparrow, thank you for raising the issue around Papatūānuku. Te reo is an official language of this country, so therefore it should actually really need, we probably need to make sure we understand it, but it shouldn't need interpretation. It should be able to stand on its own. Well, good luck. Good luck putting sign language into a written document there, though. That would be the challenge I would have for you. But I guess my concern about the natural environment, I could say, well, if there's nowhere else I can hang that in that document, that's the place I can. So Papatūānuku, looking after Mother Earth, I'll take that as being looking after the natural environment as a whole. Kia ora.
Put it to the vote. Now, is there anyone who would like to take, it's been brought to my attention we could take parts 3A and 3B separately if that enabled Councillor Rush to perhaps vote for one and not the other, or would you prefer, is there any need to take anything separately?
I've moved as the substantive, which means that Councillor Rush either had to move an amendment to take something out, which he hasn't done, or vote against something if he doesn't want to vote for it. That's his choice.
So
well,
in
what's
order
3A
to be
and
helpful,
what's 3B?
We can have a quick look at them now.
This is the classic last-minute amendments, and
okay, all right. I'm just offering the chance to take it separately. So we will take it separately. We'll do 1 and 2 together, then we'll do 3A and then 3B. It's up to everybody how they choose to vote.
if I might just say, I was trying to collect it all together in one place so that we didn't have to go through this. So, and I unfortunately,
when I say 3A, debate now, but
not a debate. I just wouldn't mind having. Okay, go for it. Exactly. Well, I've got Tab's original.
It's there. It's there.
Oh, sorry. Thank you very much.
I couldn't.
So
I could hardly see him. Yeah.
Okay, this is just. I think I can.
Okay.
All right, let's just do the whole lot one go.
You want to do the whole lot together?
One go.
Okay.
We love each other. Yep. Aroha, aroha.
Okay. We're going to put it all together. So would you like to now vote either yes or no for all of those recommendations, 1, 2, 3A and 3B? And if you wish, you can have a division. Thank you for that, colleagues. That's passed unanimously. I would just like to note that Councillor Wolf was with us for part of the meeting, but wasn't actually present when we had the vote because his internet dropped out, but he was present for some of it. We're going to have, I will now close the meeting. We will then have a little bit of an adjournment until 3 o'clock. So if we'd like to stand for the, yeah. Right, so unahia, ki te uru tapanui, kia mama, te tinana, te wairua, e te ara I rongo, whakaia aki ki ronga. What? Ua watia.